But then to really understand racism, you have to talk about institutions. And for me, the big kicker was culture. And cultural racism was the thing that I wrote about that no one else was writing about, even thinking about at that time. And that was where the values, the ideology, the principles, the history, the religion, all the instruments of culture conspire to privilege one cultural group over another. And so the problem of racism was not just that we were black, but it was that we came from a cultural ethos that was, in many respects, antithetical to the Western cultural ethos. And because of the cultural chauvinism or hegemonic idea, we could be minimalized and diminished in our culture. And the way you gain opportunity is to show that you can acquire the dominant culture in its language and its values and its attitudes and its behavior. And that dominance then became the beacon of success. And that to me was really the problem. And so when I wrote about cultural racism, I was trying to write about how we really are talking about a fundamental cultural clash, and that the disadvantage is not just some arbitrary ignorance about people who are different, but it's really a categorical belief system that is in opposition. So that was really the marker, I think, for prejudice and racism. And then when I came back at it like 25 years later, write the second edition, there was so much more stuff, and it became a little bit more psychological. Same basic structure, but there's so much more we knew about psychology. And it was in the second edition that I really started to write about the reactions of targets of racism. And so I only have one chapter on reaction of targets. But that's where I think much of black psychology has really made its mark, because we are really focused on how have we responded to this oppression here and around the world, including in Africa. And our principles and theories and systems are more or less attempts to understand both the reactive part, which I think is the oppression part, but also the humanizing part, the growth part that identifies our heart and soul as a people. I think we need both parts to really be whole. And that's what I've tried to do in developing my Trios model and other kinds of things. So Trios everything has a long history. It began by looking at articles on sports, and someone published an article in JPSP arguing that blacks were better at reactive activities and whites at self-paced activities. And self-paced activities were like golf and bowling, and activities where the performance is against a fairly static background. So pitching in baseball, you're in control. So in the self-paced activities, you're in control. Reactive activities, you have to respond to a changing field. And blacks were better at that, and whites were better at the other. And I said, well, if that's true, then whites should be better pitchers, not that there should be more pitchers. And they tried to prove it by showing that whites were disproportionately pitchers and blacks were disproportionately not pitchers. And it turned out that, yes, whites are disproportionately pitchers, but blacks are better. The performance, all the statistics we used to judge performance, they were better. And I looked at basketball, and turned out that there was no difference, a slight black preference in reactive, but whites were really better at free throw shooting, which is supposed to be a self-paced thing. But then I talked about cultural style and how free throw shooting doesn't have the interaction with the audience. The kind of, in the pickup games you play, people are watching and they're applauding dramatic moves, stylistic moves. So I started talking about style and improvisation. That was the first place that improvisation came in. And then I got a Guggenheim to study humor in Trinidad. So I went to Trinidad, and the first thing he told me was, oh, glad you come to Trinidad. Any time is Trinidad time. And so time became a really important part of my thinking. And then with Shango and the religious elements, I got into rhythm and spirituality. And then, of course, the calypso is all oral. And so many of these things kind of dovetail back to my experiences playing the dozens and other things in the States. And so eventually all these pieces start coming together and saying, look, there's time element, there's improvisation, there's orality. And these are not just things you sort of stick on the wall, put a pin in and say, isn't that interesting? But they become the fabric of a psyche and the fabric of a cultural ethos that is both a preference and a way of expressing humanity, but also become pragmatic as ways of responding to the challenges of being a marginalized and oppressed group. And so this led me to say, well, if we want to understand persons of African descent in the diaspora, then we have to acknowledge that they could not have left everything in Africa and survived. What would they survive with? How do you cope when you have nothing to cope with? And coping is a set of attributes that are culturally defined and socially organized and all that. So I said there has to be that. And so I use trios as that sort of proxy for that cultural capital that travels with us from Africa throughout the diaspora. And so the trios idea is that if that were true, I can't go back and prove it in the past, but I can give examples of how it could be useful. But that if that's true, then people who have these triosic, the degree that you have these triosic characteristics, you should cope better with contemporary events and circumstances. So first thing I said, well, can I measure this thing? So I developed a scale, and so I have a trio scale, and so people vary in their triosity. Blacks embrace it to a greater degree than whites do. Hispanics are slightly lower. Asians are like where whites are. I recently collected some data in Ghana, and the Ghanaians were about the same as African Americans in terms of their endorsement. But it's more than just saying I believe in these things. Does it have functional utility? And we find that people who are triosic tend to, college students particularly, are less depressed in general. They have lower anxiety, they have higher self-esteem, but they're not necessarily more likely to be reactive to racial discrimination. In fact, in some of the data we have, if you ask them to report on racial hassles in the last 6 months, those highly triosic, the degree to which you're triosic is unrelated to whether you report racial experiences. So one of the things we're interested in is trying to figure out why is that. Is it because you cope so fully with them that you don't raise them to the level of a hassle? If you handle it at the point of its occurrence in such a way that you don't encode it as a hassle, then your health is not recruited to get rid of it. It happens more or less as an automatic process. So or it could be that if the positive health benefits may come because you do code it that way, but that you resolve it in a way that buffers the negative impact. So it could go either way. The fact that it's not related to perceiving more hassles suggests that maybe it just lowers the threshold for what constitutes a hassle. So we don't know the answers to that yet, but we're working on those kinds of things. But the evidence, interestingly, was that in Ghana, the relationship between trios and moderating the stress well-being relationship was even stronger than with African Americans. The more triosic they were, when stress was low, trios didn't really matter in terms of their mental health. It was pretty positive. But when stress was high and mental health goes down, it goes down precipitously for those who are low in trios, and much less so, and almost little at all, for those high in trios. But that was true for Africans, but we didn't get that for African Americans. And African Americans reported more ongoing stress. So it may be that the stress was greater, so trios could only do so much with it. So they didn't get that kind of effect. I'm not sure about that. But I'm hoping to go back to Ghana in next year and collect more data and be able to more precisely answer some of those questions.